After the end of World War II, relief was quickly shadowed by something much more horrifying. As tensions rose between the US and Soviet Union, they entered an arms race to create the most destructive weapons. Under the threat of mutually assured destruction, there was an issue much scarier.
The US had no idea what the actual capabilities of the Soviet military were.
Without knowing the actual amount of power and technology that the Soviet Union held, the US was left to think of worst-case scenarios and needed to find a solution fast.
Aerial reconnaissance was a relatively new idea back then. It wasn't really able to be utilized to its full potential before the end of World War II, but now with the threat of the Soviet Union, the US needed intelligence more than ever.
Aerial reconnaissance was first utilized in the 1950s by the Navy's Special Electronic Search Program, or SESP, which was a top-secret electrical intelligence operation that operated along the European border of the Soviet Union.
It was dangerous work working for the SESP. The aircraft that they used were outdated and from World War II, and on top of that, they had no supporting aircraft on missions, because that would have drawn too much attention. Then, of course, there was always a risk of being intercepted by a Soviet plane or missile blasting you out of the sky.
With the imminent danger presented by the Soviet opposition, it was inevitable that a disaster would eventually strike, and it did in the form of the Turbulent Turtle.
The Turbulent Turtle was a tragic turn in the reconnaissance front of the Cold War, and even though everyone knew it was possible, it was still shocking when it actually happened.
The Turbulent Turtle, which was a heavy bomber repurposed for reconnaissance, left for a mission on the morning of April 8, 1950, under the SESP to gain electronic intelligence along the border between Latvia and the Soviet Union. However, the Soviet Union became aware of this, immediately dispatching 4 MiG fighter jets to intercept the aircraft, shooting it down. No survivors were found.
There are rumors about what happened to the crew, but ultimately no one knows. They could have died or been captured, but only the wreckage was ever recovered.
With the Turbulent Turtle's demise, the danger of aerial reconnaissance was realized, setting a precedent for the precariousness of future intelligence gathering endeavors.
Despite the danger that the SESP's missions presented, they continued their operations because the present danger of the Soviets' unknown power outweighed the risks.
The SESP ultimately expanded its operations into 2 squadrons by 1955, the VQ-1 and VQ-2.
By the time the SESP expanded its operations into the VQ-1 and VQ-2, there were problems in both Europe and Asia that needed to be addressed. With growing tensions in Vietnam, the VQ-1 was created to monitor the Pacific Front, serving as an important pillar for recon during the Vietnam War, so important that it remained in use to the rest of the 20th century. On the European front with the Soviet Union, the VQ-2 flew missions across the Mediterranean, though it faced much more difficulties than the VQ-1, which completed 100% of its missions during its lifespan.
As the world and technology evolved rapidly, so did the planes of reconnaissance, beginning with the F-100 Super Sabre, invented in 1954, which was the first plane that could go supersonic.
Although it initially found heavy use as a reconnaissance plane because of its speed, the Super Sabre was rendered irrelevant by the 60s, not just because it was prone to accidents, but also because technological improvements and new planes quickly overshadowed them.
The F-100 Super Sabre's worst issue was that it was unreliable. It had a turbulent development process that made it prone to crashes and accidents, and since supersonic aircraft were so new at the time, the military had trouble training pilots to fly it properly.
While the F-100 had a difficult path in reconnaissance, it not only laid the groundwork for many supersonic planes in the future, but it also soon found its niche as a jet bomber and support fighter during the Vietnam War, utilized until 1970. On the front of spy planes, while the Super Sabre was quickly rendered obsolete, the U-2 that took its place had a much more lasting impact on aerial reconnaissance.
The U-2 was one of the most integral planes to the Cold War, and although it couldn't fly at the same speeds as the Super Sabre, it flew at such a high altitude that it was difficult for enemy radar systems to detect, and even if they could be detected, missiles and fighters sent to intercept them couldn't reach such heights.
Although it found great success on many of its missions, the U-2's legacy was forever changed on May 5, 1960, during what was supposed to be a simple intel gathering mission.
The plan was simple. Fly from Pakistan to Norway, making sure to fly through the Soviet Union to gather intel. A pretty standard procedure.
However, in the middle of the mission, the plane was intercepted by a Soviet missile and shot down, and even though pilot Francis Gary Powers was able to eject in time and land safely, he was soon captured by the USSR and held prisoner.
After this, the US went into full panic mode because they were actually supposed to have a peace summit with the Soviet Union and France later that month. And now that a U-2 had been shot down in the territory, they were left on thin ice with the Russians.
Despite the wreckage being recovered and the pilot being captured, the US denied the authorization of any flight through Soviet airspace and even began a misinformation campaign, alleging that the plane that was shot down was actually a weather plane, in which the pilot went incautious and drifted into hostile territory. The Soviet Union quickly disproved this, and combined with the US's refusal to apologize for the incident, any hopes of de-escalation that the summit held crumbled.
Interestingly, the incident actually helped create a massive shift in the field of aerial reconnaissance, because the missile that destroyed the U-2 was a new form of this technology that provided the Soviets with the power to reach high altitudes that the U-2 was so famous for, destroying America's advantage and forcing them to gravitate towards the speed of their spy planes over their height ceilings.
First utilized in 1959, the Soviet SA-2 guideline missile was a massive step in the Soviet Union's ability to counter the US's reconnaissance missions. With a maximum speed of Mach 3.5 and a range of around 27 miles, it proved to be a missile that could quickly and efficiently reach the high altitudes of spy planes.
The guideline not only helped the Soviets counter aerial reconnaissance missions, but they were also adopted by the Vietnamese during Operation Rolling Thunder and NATO, becoming one of the most important missiles not just during the Cold War, but in modern history.
Fittingly, the SA-2 guideline missile has become the most widely used missile in the world, still finding use in the present day as an aerial defense measure.
Now that the US had to worry about the threat of missiles like the SA-2 reaching their high-altitude spy planes, the U-2 fell out of relevance, and the military had to come up with a new plane so they could keep track of the USSR's military power.
In 1964, the US struck gold with the invention of the SR-71 Blackbird, the most famous reconnaissance plane to date. With a service ceiling of around 85,000 feet and a top speed of 2,200 miles per hour, the Blackbird was the fastest manned aircraft ever made up to that point, quickly becoming the most heavily used and reliable spy plane of the Cold War and latter half of the 20th century.
The Blackbird managed to do something that other planes failed to do: fly both high and fast, and this made it an unstoppable machine.
The Blackbird has a near-perfect track record as far as planes go. It flew over 3,500 missions across 32 planes, but it was remarkably never shot down. Only 12 were ever lost to accidents, and only one pilot ever died. It could outrun, outmaneuver even the fastest enemy aircraft.
The Blackbird's nearly spotless record didn't come without trial, however. Reports show that over 4,000 missiles were fired at different Blackbirds during missions, coming as close as within 100 meters from the aircraft. In one case, in 1986, a Blackbird was pushed to his limits when a surface-to-air missile attempted to intercept it on a mission over Liberia. To evade the missile, pilot Brian Shull had to throttle the engine and escape at roughly 2250 miles per hour, 50 miles over its alleged top speed. Its capability to fly fast enough to evade these missiles made the Blackbird invaluable to the US in their efforts in aerial reconnaissance. Although aeronautical engineering and reconnaissance seemingly peaked in 1964 with the invention of the Blackbird, a new technology was on the horizon, one that would revolutionize the world of intelligence gathering and prove to be an integral pillar of modern warfare.
The Cold War was a time of technological advancement beyond the scope of anything thought possible. From nuclear research to the space race, mankind always found a way to outdo itself in every way with each passing year. But while this was happening, issues also began to arise in the Middle East, which sort of facilitated the same type of technological advancement for these countries. It's no surprise that a completely new form of reconnaissance came out during this time through the invention of surveillance drones like the...
In 1973, Israel created the Tataran Mastiff, the first modern UAV. At only 172 pounds, it was both mobile and completely unmanned, with a camera attached to it for spying and collecting data. It found its most effective use during the Yom Kippur War, where it was used to scout out difficult-to-reach areas.
With traditional reconnaissance, a lot of the danger came from pilots who had to risk capture and death to collect intel. But drones completely removed pilots from the equation. They were able to gather intelligence and scout enemies, completely unmanned with the crew managing from miles away, so they found great use as short-range spy planes. The Tataran Mastiff pioneered a transition into unmanned reconnaissance and warfare, and we can see how it's affected combat even today.
Not only was the Tataran Mastiff an important invention in the way that it was one of the first major developments in the Middle Eastern conflict, but it also pioneered the use of UAVs in combat and established Israel as a future powerhouse in this industry, raising its importance on a global scale.
As the Cold War ended, conflicts in the Middle East continued to boil throughout the 90s, and when the US had to intervene in these conflicts, they began to use drone technology as well.
America knew that they had to get on board with the idea of UAVs if they wanted their military to stay on top, especially because the terrain in the Middle East was extremely difficult to operate on.
Developed by Abraham Karem in 1996, the MQ-1 Predator rapidly became one of the most infamous drones, with versatile uses in both surveillance and direct combat throughout the Middle East.
The Predator drone pretty much solidified the presence of unmanned vehicles in war, especially within the field of reconnaissance, and being one of the pioneers of this field ultimately shaped the way the military uses drones today.
Even though the Second World War has long since passed, the battle for technology has continued through the likes of bombs, space travel, and aerial reconnaissance. The challenges proposed by tensions like the Cold War or Middle Eastern conflicts have only fueled the advancement of ever-evolving spy planes, and with the continued trajectory of tensions even today, the field of aerial reconnaissance serves a pivotal role in its continued presence on the front lines of both military technology and the battlefield.